Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In 1978, Alasdair MacIntyre gave a short presentation called Designing Our Descendants, and it's really well worth looking at because in it he sets out a number of traits that he calls virtues in that particular presentation and suggests that these are the things that we would want our descendants, people who are following behind us generationally, to have so that they can flourish in the world that we're moving into and then that they're going to inhabit, and in some respects make it a better world, a better society. So he begins by making a distinction between two ways in which we can envisage the problem of designing our descendants. That is, what kind of people do we want to leave behind? And he says that one way we can look at this is in a rather individualistic way, although it's tied with families. He says that we can think about what are we to do as parents in raising our own children. So if I raise my children a certain way, that has nothing to do with how this person over here raises their children, but we can look at it in another way, the one that he's more interested in. He says, what may be desirable traits to engender and construct in a whole society, in whatever you want to call it, a culture, in a civilization. He says it's the latter question I've chosen to answer, and so I'm going to ask, insofar as we possess techniques for systematically favoring or promoting in our descendant some traits and behaviors rather than others, ought we to do so? And in the interests of what ideals or goals? And he says, I'm not concerned with picturing one ideal type of individual, but describing traits that might be found scattered throughout a population. So not every single person will necessarily have every single one of these traits. And then he says, the problem that I then confront turns out to be what he's going to call a political problem. Now, he doesn't mean political just in the narrow sense of voting and parties and stuff like that. What he means is the classical sense of living together in a society where we have some degree of input, where we do have to make our case to other people. It's not just about force or deception or fraud or things like that, but some manner of deliberation with people who don't see things the other way. And he says that what we will be permitted to do to promote certain traits will not be determined solely by the level of our technical ability to bring about such change, nor by the desire and commitment of the relevant groups of scientists, nor even by those who immediately control the particular technologies. Decisions about large-scale changes of this kind are and will be political decisions. So these will be determined by those who hold social and political power more generally. And he says, okay, so we're going to actually put the mechanics of that to one side. Let's think about what virtues we should cultivate. And he uses the term virtue here, and he suggests that what we would be doing here is identifying virtues not just for our descendants, but also virtues that we ought to have. And he talks about this as a task of constructing a new table of the virtues, even if only a partial one. Now, it's interesting because this table of the virtues notion is something that actually comes from, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, right? And what are going to be these virtues? Well, that's the bulk of this address. He's going to single out 7 different characteristics or traits that he thinks ought to be encouraged, cultivated, developed. And he's going to provide not just examples, but reasons why he thinks these are important. So the first one, ability to live with uncertainty. Something that a lot of people in the present give lip service to. Ooh, we have to be able to manage change and disruption and all that. Lots of people are great at saying that. Actually being able to handle uncertainty, well, that's quite different. So he says, to an unspecifiable degree, the future is unpredictable. This unpredictability immediately raises difficult questions for the project designing traits for the future. No trait can be thought of being good or bad independently of the environment in which it flourishes, towards which it will organize human responses, and from which it will derive material for the tasks. And then he says, is the future necessarily unpredictable? If so, why? And he gives a bunch of examples. He talks about, the unpredictability of natural science and its development. And he brings up Karl Popper. And then he brings up some things that are not just natural science, but also philosophical and cultural developments. He talks about, not just the Copernican, or the discovery of quantum mechanics, but Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy, or Luther's doctrine of the justification of fide sola, faith alone, right? And then he's going to talk about mathematics. And, MacIntyre is somebody who developed in a time when the great confidence that certain philosophers had in mathematics, as at least in this field, we know we can make complete progress, turned out not to be the case, right? And so he's going to say, in the light of all this, how are we to design anyone? The answer is clear. He says, we will have to design people with all of those traits, whatever they may be, necessary for living in an unpredictable environment, people with an ability to live with a large lack of certainty about their future. So in some respect, the first virtue is less clear than what the other ones are going to be, but all of those feed into living in a world that we not only know is going to change, but we don't know which directions that change is going to take. Then he talks about roots and particularity. And I think this is something that a lot of people do associate with Alasdair MacIntyre. We need to think of ourselves as belonging to particular communities within particular narratives. And he is going to, do some bashing of the universal liberal, the person whose moral substance is expressed only in an appeal to impersonal, impartial standards in such a way that he's equally at home everywhere in the world, so that he's at home nowhere, right? And he actually talks about suburban neighborhoods, particularly in America, being hives of this sort of thing. So coming back a little bit in the essay, he says that only those who genuinely know who they are will be able to live with unpredictability in a creative way. So he's not saying that only those who know who they are, in the sense that he's talking about here, where they belong, will be able to deal with unpredictability at all. But if you want to respond in a creative, not a reactive way, you need to actually have some situating. He says human beings can only know who they are if they know what their past was. The past is, after all, what made them into what they are in the present. Such people are able to find a successful home in the world because they can identify themselves through their place in a family, a neighborhood, a community, a city, a nation. They know themselves to be part of projects that extend from the past into the future in such a way that their own work in the world receives its significance from its part in these larger projects. And he goes on to say, I must have learned to whom I belong, to whom I have debts, to whom I owe gratitude, against whom I must stand. And so he concludes, such an identity is local, specific, and particular. So he says it's important that people have homes in this extended sense, homes that are not simply particular buildings, particular small groups of people, but places in which they are at home in the world and to which they can return in the face of the strange and the unpredictability. So, how do you actually cultivate that? Well, that's a great question. But we move on to another really key MacIntyrean point. You will see him using this language of non-manipulative relations throughout his works. He thinks that this is really quite important, and he says that the emphasis on particularity might make you think that I don't have anything to do with the universal ideas, and that it's going to be at odds with any Kantian emphasis on objectivity and impersonality. But he says, well, we can actually get that. Why? If our relationship with others are to be non-manipulative. So this is a negative, right? He says there's two modes in which I can confront others. I can do so as one whose desires are organized in such a way as to make the strongest and most influential impression upon them. So I can present myself in the world much as a serial commercial presents itself on television. Or, so this is the other alternative, I can present myself as someone who's prepared to act together with others, subject to the authority of common criteria of judgment, criteria that are neither mine nor theirs, but those of a rational virtue. So he goes on and he says, if I urge upon you a given course of action because it is just or courageous or honest or your duty, what am I actually appealing to? Am I just trying to manipulate you the way that some people think about morality? That could be the case if I'm using those words in a manipulative way. However, if I'm really appealing to these, I'm appealing to standards by which I am also judged as well as judging others. I don't seek to make you merely an instrument of my preferences and my desires. And he notes, by the very nature of the appeal to standards of virtue, my preferences and desires have been relegated to a secondary place. Now, it's very interesting. Not only does he think that we need to develop this habit of approaching other people in a non-manipulative way, which is what he calls a trait of moral impersonality, right? We also need to do this not just with respect to human beings, but with respect to nature. He says, nature has to be approached in a way that combines manipulative and non-manipulative modes. So, we need to have a respect for nature and for its integrity, a respect for what evolution has brought about, and a sense of proportion about ourselves as a small part of nature. So there's, you could say, a cosmic kind of dimension to this, as well as an interpersonal and societal dimension. The fourth that he talks about, he calls finding a vocation in one's work. And he points out, so he begins by saying, everyone needs to find some productive work to do in the world. If their lives are to have point and meaning, productive work has point and purpose because of the way it involves us in common enterprises with others and because of the ways in which it is doing in and for itself. And we might add to that, what it does for others that we are connected with as well. So I could think of myself as doing productive work to put food on the table for my children who I want to have a better life than myself. And so I do this work that isn't intrinsically interesting to me, but is nonetheless worthwhile. And he brings up this funny example of G.K. Chesterton getting a hard time during the World War I from a bunch of ladies who are handing out these white feathers to people that are, they think, trying to avoid military service. And they're asking him, why aren't you at the front with the other men fighting to preserve our civilization? And Chesterton says, lady, I'm doing that civilization right here. That's part of what I am preserving, right? And so MacIntyre says it's important for every one of us to be able to say this. It's important that the work we're doing is not simply for the sake of something else, but also for its own sake, that there's something there in it. And he says, thinking only or even primarily in terms of outcome and consequences can be destructive of worthwhile work. To recognize this entails recognizing everybody needs work. To allow unemployment is a grave wrong, and to provide conditions to work in which work cannot be done well is only less wrong than to allow unemployment. Very interesting thing to say about our present economy, isn't it? So he's not just saying that individuals need to figure out for themselves where their passion lies. He's saying this is something that ought to be made available for everybody within any decent society. Here's another very interesting one in 5, accepting one's death. So he says, if I have work to do in the world, there will be a time when it's done. And when that time comes, it is right for me to die. If I don't accept this, if I try to extend my life indefinitely, notice this phrase, I shall become an intruder upon the next generation. I shall lose my own place in the world and try to usurp that of others. So each generation needs to learn how to get out of the way. And we could even say it doesn't necessarily have to be death. We could even think in terms of passing on responsibilities and retiring and allowing the next generation to come up, not trying to control them, not trying to, determine in a sort of gerontocracy, a term that we see thrown around a lot these days, at least here in the United States, where the old are determining what's going to happen for the middle-aged and the young. He says, each of us is permitted to occupy a certain space and time, a certain role in history. Without that particular place and role, our lives would be emptied of significance. And so he talks about Americans being subject to a particular problem, a destructive desire to remain young, to not accept mortality, to not move on, right? So we should be more accepting of that. He doesn't say an awful lot more about that. That's one of the shorter sections. And then he moves on to a single word, hope. Here he actually has a lot to say. In order to link past and future effectively in our present lives, he says we need the virtue of hope. And what is hope? Hope is in place precisely in the face of evil, which tempts us to despair, the opposite of hope, and more especially that evil which belongs specifically to our own age and condition. We are only, as he says, a short distance in time and culture from the Holocaust produced by the most cultured nation in the world. We're a shorter distance still from our own Vietnam War. This is 1978. He's saying this. Something about which we find it difficult to speak even now, right? And he goes on and he says, evil that seems overwhelming is all too present in the modern world. Hope is the virtue that enables us to trust in the victory of good over evil, even in the face of overwhelming evil. He says the presupposition of hope is belief in a reality that transcends what is available as evidence. And then he goes on and says something really quite fascinating. This is long before MacIntyre announces his allegiance to, religious thinkers such as Augustine, let alone Thomas Aquinas, in books coming after Virtue, like Whose Justice, Which Rationality, or Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. He says, hope challenges any merely secular conception of reason. Therefore, it's the virtue that challenges the belief of enlightenment, that it is ignorance and irrationality alone that hinder us in our approach to the future, that the growth of scientific knowledge and understanding will save us. So two important things there. One is the Enlightenment ideology is not going to be as helpful as we think. The other is there's got to be something that surpasses a merely secular framework or horizon, right? So what's the last of these? He's going to say, sort of similar to the first one that connects them together, this one is also needed in order for the other ones to be effective. So he reminds us what the other six are. And then he says, if these are the virtues we wish to promote, we will have to recognize there is no way of either promoting them or living them uncontroversially, right? Our present knowledge of how to shape behavior equips us more adequately to change people for the worse than for the better. So if we want to design our descendants in good ways, we have to recognize, he says, that there will be those who want to design them in ways incompatible with the virtues I have praised. And he goes on and he says that among the virtues must be accounted the kind of courage that is involved in a willingness, as he says, to go to war and to acquire and use the skill necessary to win a war. There's no point in going to war unless you intend to win. So, this doesn't necessarily have to mean armed struggle, as he says. It can also involve the most peaceful substitute for it that you can contrive, but you're going to have to deal with conflict. And you're going to have to deal with the fact that other people don't see these as important, or they give lip service to them, but then they set things up in such a way as to not produce these. So you're always going to have to push against those who are interfering with that. What then would a society, assuming that we could actually inculcate these new virtues, the new table of the virtues, these aren't radically new. We have these in many other pre-modern people. What would it be like if we could actually develop this? He says, in a society with the traits I've envisaged, men and women will only be consumers because they will have needs that must be satisfied if they're to get their work done. Production will not be for the sake of consumption, but consumption for the sake of production and action, and we will have abjured what Americans have understood as the search for happiness. In the kind of society I've described, there will be many kinds of enjoyment, but the notion that happiness, in the sense that happiness is identified with consumption, is the end of a desirable life, will have been discarded. He says we will not be looking for a society in which there's a deep desire to stay young. We will not want as fellow citizens the kind of people who are determined to make the environment predictable at all costs and who wish to fence around unpredictability wherever it's to be found. Nor will we want as fellow citizens those who seek to manipulate and control by non-rational means, right? And he says, this means that we'll have to reject a certain kind of bureaucracy. And he says, be careful here. We're not talking about rejecting bureaucracy and bureaucrats just for its own sake. That's just an attack on government. And he says, by the way, the view that I'm taking here is that those who want to mold our economic life by means of a market are just as much bureaucratic planners as those who propose a socialist economy Mine is not an argument against liberals in favor of conservatives. It's an argument against all of those, whether the right or the left, who offer us a priori blueprints of a kind that treats society as a substance to be remolded. And we might think about, the solutions proposed by people in our own time. And then he talks about an even more radical conclusion that follows, one that's kind of paradoxical. So this is really an interesting place to end. He says, if in designing our descendants, we succeed in designing people who possess just those traits I've described, we would have contrived for ourselves descendants who would be unable, by virtue of those very traits, to adopt manipulative bureaucratic modes of planning. And this means that they would be quite unwilling in turn to design their descendants. We would have brought our own project of designing descendants to an end, right? And so he says, here's some very practical consequences. If we conclude the project of designing our descendants would, if successful, result in descendants who would reject that project, it would clearly be better never to embark on that project at all. Otherwise, we shall risk producing descendants who will be deeply ungrateful and aghast at the people ourselves who brought them into existence. So how is this concluding? Is this irony on MacIntyre's part? Is this a genuine paradox that he's pointing out? Should we still be advocating for and trying to inculcate these traits as often and as widely as possible? That's where it effectively ends. But notice what he has done in this, which is to single out some traits that are going to be pretty important in MacIntyre's larger moral philosophy.